It was never printed in official prayer books, nor proclaimed from the pulpits. It did not carry a Latin title or theological annotations. And yet, in quiet corners of convents and in the worn pockets of old monks, this prayer endured. Passed, hand to hand, heart to heart, like a whispered secret in a church that had long forgotten how to listen. It was written on scraps of paper, etched into the margins of old breviaries, memorized by elderly nuns who no longer remembered where or how they first learned it. It was not chanted in choirs or used in processions, but it clung to the lives of those who still believed that intimacy with God could not always be taught, only experienced. The prayer was simple, its language soft and direct, like a child speaking to a parent in the dark. There was no grandeur in its tone, no theological flourish, just a profound plea for mercy, for protection, for purification. It asked not for miracles, nor for signs, but for the heart to be hidden in the mercy of God when the storms came. And somehow it worked. Those who recited it spoke of changes they could not explain. Nights of torment became peaceful. Decisions made in fear were replaced with clarity. The burdens of grief, loss, and sin lifted, not always visibly, but in the quiet chambers of the soul. It was especially common among the elderly religious, those who had lived through war, famine, and the cultural earthquakes of the 20th century. They did not explain the prayer. They only urged others to keep it close. Some had learned it from spiritual directors now long dead. Others found it scribbled on the back of a holy card in the drawer of a deceased sister. No one knew where. It had begun, and perhaps that was the point. Like all things that flow directly from grace, it did not call attention to itself. The irony, however, was that the Church, in her official capacity, never condemned it nor canonized it. She simply overlooked it. In the vast catalogues of approved prayers and devotions, there was no entry for this one. It was too small, too quiet, too deeply personal. And so while devotion to saints and novenas flourished in some circles, this little prayer was passed like contraband by those who felt that the most urgent spiritual battles were not fought in public, but in the silence of one's own heart. In several convents in Portugal, elderly sisters would whisper it before sleep, believing it kept them safe from spiritual harm in the night. In remote mountain chapels, old priests would murmur it before confession, asking for divine clarity in the absolution they were about to give. A few who had encountered deep spiritual oppression, whispers in the night, irrational fear, shadows that clung to their homes, found peace again through its repetition. But none of them truly understood why. It was not a talisman, not a spell. It was a spiritual lifeline, and it worked not because of the words themselves, but because of the surrender they represented. Its survival was almost miraculous. As modernity swept into the Church, bringing with it new languages, new liturgical forms, and a shift in theological tone, prayers like this were abandoned as relics of an outdated spirituality. And yet, this one lingered. It was never formally taught, yet it never vanished. Something in it spoke to the soul in a way doctrine could not. It did not contradict the teachings of the Church. It simply moved beneath them, like a quiet current, pulling hearts back to the essentials: humility, trust, and complete reliance on divine mercy. Most people who encountered the prayer never knew its name. It didn't have one. But it had a purpose, and those who prayed it understood that its power did not lie in being known, but in being believed. It became a companion to the suffering, a refuge for the anxious, and a hidden weapon for the faithful. And though it was never spoken of in sermons or written on church walls, it remained alive, waiting quietly for the day when the Church would need it again. Sister Lucia had long carried the weight of a message too immense for most to comprehend. After the apparitions at Fatima, her life became cloaked in silence, first by obedience, then by necessity. Yet beneath that silence, her soul burned with the knowledge of what she had seen and heard, and the urgency of what had been entrusted to her. While the world focused on the secrets of Fatima as a historical curiosity or theological mystery, Sister Lucia knew that the most vital elements had not yet come to light, not fully, not publicly, and not with the force they were meant to carry. Years after the original messages, in her quiet convent life, Sister Lucia continued to receive interior movements of the heart, moments of grace that revealed not new information, but deeper layers of the same warning. It was not a matter of adding to the vision, but of understanding it more clearly, more painfully. The world had not changed course. In many ways, it had accelerated toward the very dangers the Blessed Mother had wept over. The Church, too, was drifting, not in doctrine, but in attention. Lucia saw how reverence was being replaced by busyness, how the simplicity of faith was being traded for intellectual speculation, and how prayer was slowly vanishing from the daily rhythm of Christian life. One evening, during one of her quiet meditations, Sister Lucia wrote a private letter, not addressed to the Vatican but to a trusted spiritual director. In it, she did not reveal any new secret, but she made a striking comment. She wrote that there was a certain prayer which, when prayed with sincerity, had the power to pierce through the spiritual confusion of these times and preserve the soul from deception. She claimed it had been given as a hidden protection, a spiritual antidote, meant especially for what she described as the age of spiritual fog. This prayer was not composed by theologians nor found in any standard liturgical collection. It was short, simple, and almost childlike in tone. But she insisted it carried a grace particularly necessary for the faithful who would one day face what she called the silence of shepherds and the rise of many voices. She never called it the third secret, nor did she claim it should replace any official devotion. But the implication was clear. This prayer had been revealed not for prestige or publication, but for survival. In the same letter, Sister Lucia recounted an interior vision in which she saw souls wandering in a vast, dark valley. They were calling out, but their voices echoed back to them. There were no stars, no direction, only the sound of confusion and sorrow. And then a soft voice began to repeat the words of that prayer, once, twice, again, and a small flame appeared, then another, then dozens, lighting the way forward. It was not dramatic. It was not miraculous in the cinematic sense, but it was real, and it was enough. The letter was never published. It was kept quietly in a private archive, its contents known only to a handful of clergy. But copies of the prayer began to circulate without explanation, without context, just the words, just the plea. And those who received it knew it was not to be questioned, but used. Sister Lucia's knowledge was never rooted in theological innovation. She was not a scholar. She was a vessel. Her insights were born of silence, suffering, and unshakable obedience. She saw clearly what many refused to admit, that the real crisis was not political or institutional, but spiritual. And in that crisis, the only remedy would be a return to prayer not as a formality, but as a lifeline. She often spoke of how Our Lady had not come to announce destruction, but to call for repentance. The message was never meant to scare, but to stir. And yet, she feared that even among the faithful, too few had truly responded. The rosary, yes, had survived, but the interior attitude of contrition and surrender had withered. That is why, in her heart, she clung to this other prayer, because it required nothing but humility. It asked nothing but trust, and it promised, quietly, to lead the soul back to the place where it could hear heaven again. Sister Lucia never promoted the prayer publicly, never spoke of it in interviews, never argued for its inclusion in any formal devotion. She simply used it. And she waited for the moment when the world would be quiet enough, desperate enough, to remember what heaven had already given it in secret. It was said that Padre Pio's day began and ended in silence. Deep, absorbing, silence that was not empty but full, overflowing with invisible battles and sacred presence. Few knew exactly what prayers he used in the privacy of his cell, but those who lived near him noticed patterns, rhythms, rituals that never changed. Among these there was one prayer, quiet, brief, unknown to most, that he clung to with unwavering devotion. He never announced it publicly, he never instructed others to adopt it. Yet those who overheard fragments during his early morning whispers or caught a glimpse of the crumpled paper folded inside his missal understood that this prayer was unlike the others. It was not part of the standard breviary. It wasn't found in manuals of popular devotion. It lived in his soul like a hidden wound, offering refuge and weapon all in one. This prayer, the same one mentioned decades earlier by Sister Lucia in a private letter, was something he had encountered long before he ever learned of its connection to Fatima. It had come to him, perhaps, through a dying friar or an old mystic. No, one could say for certain. What mattered was that from the moment he first uttered it, Padre Pio recognized its power. Not in its words, which were plain and unadorned, but in the silence it created around them. This was not a prayer to be spoken for others. It was a descent into the interior, into a place of trembling clarity, where the soul stands naked before the mystery of God and pleads not for miracles, but for mercy. He prayed it before the confessional, when the weight of hundreds of souls would press on him hour after hour. He prayed it before Mass, when his body ached under the invisible pressure of the stigmata, and he feared that his human weakness would interfere with the grace he was about to serve. He prayed it at night, when the devil assaulted him with screams, with blows, with accusations. This prayer was his shield and his surrender. It reminded him that holiness was not earned through perfection, but through abandonment, and it gave him strength to endure the hidden torments that came with bearing the wounds of Christ in secret. The friars who lived with him noticed that when he prayed this particular devotion, a stillness would enter the room, not a quietness of sound, but of presence, as if something unseen had drawn near, watching, listening, weeping with him. There were times when visitors reported a change in the air, thick, heavy, luminous, while Padre Pio knelt alone behind the altar. Sometimes his lips barely moved, but his whole body seemed to tremble, as if he were carrying the sorrow of 1,000 souls. And always, in those moments, it was this prayer on his tongue. He never gave it a name, he never elaborated on its origin. When asked about his devotions, he would simply say, "I pray what the Lord has given me." But when the time came for one of his spiritual sons to face a grave trial, be it illness, temptation, despair, he would sometimes press into their hands a folded note bearing that simple text. He never explained it. He didn't need to. Those who received it often found that they could not stop repeating it. Not because it promised relief, but because it awakened something deeper, a forgotten ache for union with God that no other prayer had stirred. In the rare moments when Padre Pio wrote about his interior life, he described a darkness full of light and a flame that does not burn but purifies. These were the effects of the prayer. It stripped him of distractions. It confronted him with his own nothingness. It aligned his soul with Calvary, not in concept, but in experience. And in doing so, it filled him with peace that surpassed understanding. He saw this prayer as a gift for the end times, not because it predicted dates or chastisements, but because it drew the heart into the only refuge that would remain when All else collapsed. The mercy of God. He believed that as confusion spread and even the faithful lost sight of truth, there would be a need for something unshakable, not external but internal. A prayer so simple that any soul could say it, and so deep that no darkness could withstand it. He prayed it not as a spiritual discipline, but as a necessity, and until his dying breath, it never left him. Those who cared for him in his final days said he clutched his crucifix and whispered something over and over, too faint to hear, too sacred to repeat. Some believe it was the rosary, others suspect it was this forgotten prayer. What is certain is that when Padre Pio closed his eyes for the last time, his face bore the peace of one who had already stepped into eternity. And somewhere, in a small piece of paper tucked into a breviary or left behind in a drawer, the words he loved so deeply remain, waiting to be spoken again, not by the many, but by the few who still remember how to pray with their whole soul. In the decades that followed the deaths of Sister Lucia and Padre Pio, the world began to change, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but quietly and subtly, like a tide pulling back from a shore. The rhythms of Catholic life, once shaped by fasting, confession, silent prayer, and sacred awe, began to shift. The Church, still beautiful, still strong in many places, nevertheless began to lose something intangible. It was not doctrine that faded, nor tradition that collapsed. It was something smaller, almost invisible, the interior flame. The sense that prayer was not only routine, but warfare. That silence was not absence, but presence. That hidden devotions, like the one Lucia and Pio had held so dear, were not optional extras, but lifelines. As the prayer faded from memory, so too did the habits it supported. Fewer people sought confession with urgency. The rosary became a nostalgic symbol rather than a practiced devotion. Sacred silence was replaced with noise, of media, of endless opinion, of distraction dressed in the clothing of relevance. Families still went to church, but many stopped praying together. Priests still preached, but many no longer burned. The faithful still believed, but for many, that belief had lost its edge. They did not expect God to move. They did not expect evil to resist. They did not expect that their soul might be under siege in ways unseen. What had once been a spiritual weapon, the prayer passed in whispers, used by saints to guard against deception, was now nearly forgotten. And the results were everywhere. Not in the form of obvious collapse, but in confusion. Moral relativism took root even in Catholic homes. Children grew up unsure not just of what the Church taught, but of whether it mattered. The line between sacred and profane blurred until the world felt flattened, no longer a battlefield of good and evil, but a sea of grey where nothing had weight. And into that void stepped countless voices, offering counterfeit light. Sister Lucia had warned of this. She had not spoken in slogans or threats, but in a deep, aching sorrow. She once wrote that the final battle would be for the family and for the soul, and that it would be marked not by fire from the sky, but by silence. A silence that muffled truth, dulled the conscience, and replaced prayer with performance. Padre Pio, too, had seen it coming. He had spoken of how the devil's greatest triumph is not when people rebel, but when they forget. To forget the danger, to forget the grace, to forget the prayer. There were still holy souls, still faithful hearts, still movements of the Spirit, but they were scattered, often isolated, and increasingly surrounded by noise that made it hard to hear heaven. And because the prayer had been forgotten, so too was the deep readiness it had cultivated. The soul that once cried out daily for protection, for mercy, for clarity, now drifted through days without anchor. Spiritual attacks went undiagnosed. Despair was called burnout. Sin was called struggle, and grace was mistaken for luck. Some began to feel it without knowing why. An interior emptiness, a vague anxiety that never lifted, a disconnection from the sacred even in sacred spaces. Priests wept in their rectories and could not explain why. Parents lost their children to ideologies they barely understood. Churches remained open, but hearts remained closed. And those who tried to speak of the old ways, the silent disciplines, the obscure prayers, the call to interior vigilance, were often dismissed as nostalgic, or worse, divisive. It was in this spiritual drought that a few began to search. Not for novelty, but for roots. They combed through old books, asked elders, reread forgotten letters, and here and there someone found it, the little prayer. The one that had no name, the one that had saved saints in silence. And as they began to pray it again, something shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. Because even though the prayer had been forgotten by many, it had not been erased. Heaven had not withdrawn it. It was still waiting, waiting in drawers, in margins, in the worn pockets of the faithful. Waiting in the breath of those who still whispered, "Hide me, purify me, protect me." And as the world grew louder, the rediscovery of that prayer became not just an act of devotion, but of survival. It did not begin with trumpets or revelations. There were no official announcements, no endorsements from pulpits, no headlines proclaiming its return. Instead, it came quietly, as it always had. One person at a time. A grandmother leafing through an old prayer book found a folded page tucked between the Psalms. A seminarian cleaning out a forgotten drawer in the monastery library came across a handwritten note in trembling script. A young woman in a moment of despair stumbled upon the words online, posted anonymously by someone who claimed only to be passing on what was given. These were not coordinated events. They were untraceable, unplanned. But they formed a thread, thin, hidden, but unbreakable, woven through time by grace. Those who discovered the prayer felt something immediate, not awe, not fear, but recognition. It was as if their souls had been waiting for it. The words were simple, yet they pierced through noise, excuses, and doubt. They did not promise prosperity, nor did they demand perfection. They invited surrender. And in a world addicted to control, that invitation came like rain on parched ground. The first to begin praying it again didn't tell anyone. They weren't trying to form a movement. They just needed to breathe. Slowly, things began to shift. People who had felt spiritually numb for years described a return of clarity. Confession no longer felt like routine, but like rescue. The Mass no longer seemed distant, but devastatingly real. Even silence began to change. It was no longer emptiness, but presence. The prayer seemed to reawaken not just piety, but urgency. It reminded the soul that time was short, that eternity was real, and that God had not stopped speaking. Only that his voice had grown quiet so that the faithful would be forced to still themselves to hear it. In places where the church seemed asleep, pockets of revival began to emerge. Not loud, not organized, but holy. Monks who had abandoned their vocations returned. Women who had lost their children to the world began to pray again with fire. Young men who had never considered God found themselves weeping before the Eucharist after only a few weeks of repeating the words each night before sleep. It was not the prayer itself that had power, but the disposition it created. It was like a spiritual clearing, a place where grace could land without resistance. Priests began to speak of strange confessions, people arriving without knowing why, unable to explain what had brought them in, only that something in them had been stirred. In parishes where attendance had dwindled, small groups began to gather, not for programs but for prayer. Not because they were told to, but because something interior compelled them. And when asked what they were doing, many of them simply responded, "I'm just trying to remember." The most extraordinary part of this movement was how ordinary it looked. There were no conferences, no public leaders, no books or merchandise. There were only souls, hungry, wounded, listening. They didn't ask for explanations. They didn't argue over meanings. They prayed, and as they did, they began to see the fruit. Addictions faded, marriages healed, fear lifted. Not overnight and not in every case, but often enough that even the skeptical began to notice. Eventually, some church leaders began to take note, not because they planned it, but because they could not ignore it. A bishop in a small diocese wrote a pastoral letter on the power of hidden prayer. A cloistered convent that had not accepted novices in years quietly received 5 young women in a single month. A small seminary, once scheduled for closure, overflowed with applicants whose only common answer to the question, "Why are you here?" was, "Something called me back." In the end, the return of the forgotten prayer did not resemble revival as the world understood it. It was not explosive. It was hidden, like a seed breaking open underground. But it was real. And those who carried it, those hidden hearts scattered across the globe, knew they were part of something not yet fully visible but undeniably alive. They were not prophets. They were not saints. They were witnesses. And in their quiet persistence, the church began to breathe again. What had been forgotten returned not through force, but through love. Not through systems, but through longing. And the prayer, once whispered by a few dying souls in darkened chapels, now moved like a current beneath the surface of the church, shaping it, purifying it, and preparing it. For what, they could not say. Only that something sacred had been entrusted to them, and this time they would not forget.